Let me just begin by saying the past 7 days have been pretty tough. Many of you may be aware that last Sunday afternoon, about 4 p.m. Central Standard Time, my Kentucky Wildcats season came to a screeching halt when the Kansas State Wildcats beat them. So, it's been an up and down year all year, right? A roller coaster ride for us UK fans, and they played so well all the entire game except that last minute and 30 seconds. Some desperation threes from the Wildcats from Kansas State and some missed opportunities on the offensive end, and there we found ourselves. So my wife's been telling me all week, like, Phil, it's just a game, and I'm getting there slowly, right? I'll just say that I was extremely comforted by the fact that many of the teams that those in this area cheer for also found the same fate. That made that pill go down quite much easier, right? So despite my team making a very early exit from the NCAA tournament once again, I've still been watching the games. Maybe you have been too. There's just something about this tournament that kind of draws me in. I'm guilty as charged. I love the competition. We watched several of the games yesterday, and minus the one late game, a lot of competition, a lot of excitement, and I love the Cinderella story. Who doesn't want to cheer for the Florida, Atlanta Owls, right? Hoot, hoot, right? Who doesn't want to just get on that bandwagon and cheer for them, right? I just love those stories. I also say the thing that I love the most are those moments when somebody steps up. It could be a coach. They call a timeout. They gather their team around them. They pull out that whiteboard. They draw up something that might have a very narrow chance of success. But in that moment, they're willing to put it all on the line to hopefully get over the hump and to gain a victory. Sometimes it's one of the players. Maybe it's a player on the defensive side that just makes an incredible defensive stance at the end of the game and stops the other team from scoring. Or then there's that long-range three-pointer that swishes the net and helps that team win and advance, right? I love all of that, right? When I watch those moments happen, when there's all the seasons on the line, it comes down to this one play, this one shot, this one decision, I see courage. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We've been looking at some of the character traits of Jesus over the past couple weeks, trying to learn how you and I can live and love like him. And courage is not one that makes a lot of the list at times, but as I was walking through the last days of Jesus before his crucifixion, something that just jumped off the page to me was courage. It also got me thinking about my childhood watching The Wizard of Oz. You remember that old movie, right? Where Dorothy Gale from Kansas gets blown out of her home in Kansas by a tornado. She ends up in the merry old land of Oz, right? And her attempt is to go and find the wizard who can hopefully help her get back to her Auntie Em. Along the way, she meets some friends. There's the Scarecrow, there's the Tin Man, and then there's the lion, right? The lion is known as the king of the jungle, right? But this lion is actually scared of his own shadow. He kind of laments about what it would be like if he was king by singing, "If I was king of the forest." You know that song? Yeah, I'm not going to sing it for you, spare you from that, right? But basically what he does is he talks about what it would look like if he had courage. If he was king, he knows that everything would bow to him. It kind of strikes up a conversation then among his newfound friends, Dorothy, the Tin Man, and also the Scarecrow. And they kind of ask him, "Your Majesty, if you were king, you wouldn't be afraid of anything?" To which the lion responds, "Not nobody, not no how. Not even a rhinoceros? Imposterous," he says. "How about a hippopotamus? Well, I'd trash him from top to bottomless. Suppose you met an elephant. I'd wrap him up in cellophane. What if it was a brontosaurus? Well, I'd show him who's king of the forest." And so they ask him, "How would you do those things?" And he said, "How? Courage." And then the lion goes on this diatribe. Maybe you can play along as we go through this. He says, "What makes a king out of a slave? Courage," right? "What makes the flag on a mast to wave? Courage. What makes the elephant charge his tusk in the misty mist on the dusky dusk? Courage. What makes the muskrat guard his musk? Courage. What makes the dawn come up like thunder? Courage. What makes the Hottentot so hot? What puts ape and apricot? What do they have that I ain't got? Courage. To which the lion says, you can say that again. He recognizes that he is deficient on courage. And today, what I'd like for us to do is walk with Jesus through a moment in his life, specifically from the moment he is arrested in the garden to the moment he's sentenced to death by crucifixion. And watch how Jesus walks through this moment and look at the courage he exhibits and maybe learn how you and I can figure out how we can be more courageous. Somebody defined courage as this. Courage is the attitude of mind and the state of heart that enables us to face danger, obstacles, and challenges of life fearlessly, purposefully, and calmly. Somebody said that courage is not the absence of fear, it's actually our response to it. Like many of the moments we've looked at over the past couple of weeks, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the first 4 books of the New Testament, all record these moments of Jesus' life. They all sprinkle in some of their unique details from their perspective. And so today we're going to look at this moment from Jesus being arrested to him being sentenced to crucified. And we're going to spend a lot of time in John. So I'd encourage you to turn to John 18. We'll also look at a couple of the other gospel accounts of moments like this, but we'll pick up right where we left off with Jesus last week. He's been praying in the garden with his disciples, 11 of the 12. Judas has already gone away to do what he's arranging. We'll see him reemerge in just a moment. And Jesus has gone 3 times in prayer, saying a prayer of dependence to God. He said, Father, if it is possible, take this cup of suffering from me, yet not what I want to be done, but what your will is, God. It's on the heels of praying that prayer that we see Jesus arrested. Look at John chapter 18. We'll begin reading in verse 2. It says, now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches and lanterns and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, who is it that you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. I am he, Jesus said. Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, I am he, they drew back and they all fell to the ground. Again, he asked them, who is it that you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they said. Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. If you're looking for me, then let these men go. This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I've not lost one of those you gave me. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. And that servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, put away your sword. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? I see courage in Jesus as he displayed confidence in his identity as well as his purpose. When Judas approached Jesus in the garden that night, he didn't shrink back from that moment. When Judas placed a kiss on his cheek as a typical sign of betrayal, in that moment, Jesus had courage. Judas was surrounded by a mob, people who were soldiers from the temple guard, the chief religious people, and also there was a large presence of Roman soldiers in case things got crazy. Most scholars think that there were up to 600 people who entered the garden that night to arrest Jesus, probably about a little more that's in this room right now. Picture all of us walking into the garden and confronting Jesus. They had torches and lanterns and weapons. But Jesus didn't flinch in the face of betrayal from a close friend. In fact, when Jesus asked them, who do you want? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth, his response was, I am. That's the most literal translation of how Jesus responded and identified himself. It's the exact words that reference the God Jehovah, I am. As I mentioned a couple weeks ago, John records Jesus making 7 I am statements. And when Jesus made this one, the reaction was so strong compared to all the others. John records that when Jesus said, I am, all the people there fell on the ground. It wasn't in worship, it was actually in fear. Seeing Jesus arrested, John records that Peter pulls out a sword and tries to cut off the head of one of the priest's servant, but he was a fisherman, not a fighter, and so he actually only lobbed off his ear. And in that moment, Jesus reprimands Peter. He says, "Put away your sword." That moment reminds me a lot of a previous moment where Peter had tried to object to Jesus' crucifixion. Jesus had told his followers what was going to happen to him. And Peter makes this bold stand like, "I will not let that happen to you." And in that moment, Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." How'd you like to be called Satan? That's not a flattering term, right? It says, "You are a stumbling block to me, Peter. You don't have in mind the things of God, but merely human concerns." In this moment, Jesus reprimands Peter by saying, "Peter, shall I not drink of the cup that the Father has given me?" Such resolve. Jesus knew his identity. He knew his purpose. He was confident in who he was. He knew that he was fully God. He knew that he was God's son. He knew that God loved him. He knew that his purpose was to drink that cup of wrath by dying on the cross for the sins of the world. He was courageous. He lived out his identity as well as his purpose. When our oldest child was kind of entering into the teenage years, she was beginning to get some freedoms. Like we would let her go to the movies with some friends or go to the mall, or she'd spend the night at some girlfriends' houses. And so because she was going to be out of the control and even the presence of us as parents, that was unsettling to us. And we had to try to figure out how can we instill to her that whatever choices she makes represents her parents, but also more importantly, represents the God she's placed her faith in as Lord and Savior. And so we kind of came up with this little phrase accidentally between her and I. I would just say to her as well, I was dropping her off somewhere, or as she was leaving the house to go somewhere, I'd say, "Hey, remember whose you are." I wanted her to remember that her decisions had a lot of ramifications, not just for her, not just for her family, but most importantly, how they reflected Jesus. I wanted her to know that if she was ever in a tight spot where maybe she felt pressured, or maybe she found herself in a compromising situation, that she should always remember who she belonged to. And I also always stress that that W is a capital W, pointing her to God. It still comes in handy today. Just last weekend, she was in New Orleans with some of her friends who were in her wedding, and I texted her that phrase, "Hey, remember ... and she knows the rest of it. She knows to remember who she is. Jesus remembered who he was. He remembered whose he belonged to. And let's see how that continues to play out in his life in this moment, where we see Jesus next questioned by a man named Annas. Look at verse 12 of John 18. The detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one person died for all the people. In verse 19, it goes on to say, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. And Jesus replied, I've spoken openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues or in the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I've said. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. Is this the way that you answer the high priest? He demanded. If I said something wrong, Jesus replied, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. It might be helpful to have a little bit of context here. Annas was the high priest reigning from AD 6 to AD 15. And in that moment, he was deposed by the Roman government. They loved to mess with the people of Israel, the nation of Israel. One of the things they would do is they would plop in a new high priest. And so after Annas, each of his 5 sons got a turn to be high priest, all appointed by Rome. And after all that failed, then they appointed a person named Caiaphas, Annas' son-in-law. One commentator described Annas as like the godfather. Even though he was not officially in charge, everybody knew that he was in charge. And so when Jesus was taken to him, it was kind of like a pre-trial hearing. The Jewish religious leaders were trying to come up with their charges that they wanted to press against Jesus. The whole interrogation violated all of the Jewish law. For example, In Jewish law, it said that you didn't bring a suspect in and interrogate them. Instead, you would gather witnesses of what people may be accusing the subject of. And they would hear the testimony of those witnesses and then bring formal charges. How Jesus was falsely accused and even struck in the face, that was all a mockery of everything that's fair and just and even lawful. In this moment, I see courage in Jesus, that he remained firm. He was not passive. He spoke confidently about his behavior and his way of life. He challenged their violation of the Old Testament law and his rights. He chose not to retaliate when they struck him in the face, but he offered accountability to them for their actions. Jesus wasn't a doormat. He was confident. He was firm. He was courageous. Matthew and Mark record the more formal trial that Jesus faced of the religious leaders. It was in front of the whole Sanhedrin, and Caiaphas, the high priest, was there. It's recorded in Mark chapter 14, where Jesus faces this entire hearing. If you want to flip over there, you can, or just listen as I read about this from Mark's account. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they didn't find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave false testimony against him. We heard him say, "I'll destroy the temple made with human hands, and in 3 days I'll build another not made with hands." Yet even their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up and asked Jesus, "Are you going to answer? What is the testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," Jesus said. There's that phrase again. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven," Jesus said. The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You've heard this blasphemy. What do you think?" And they all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him. They struck him with their fists, and they said, "Prophesy." And then the guards took him away and beat him. Have you ever been falsely accused? Have you ever felt like the system is stacked against you? Have you ever been punched in the nose? I see some of the players in the ball games and they get, hit by inadvertent elbow. Some of them are intentional, but you can just see the pain on their face and then the slow motion when they go back. Well, in this moment, Jesus is struck in the face. Ever been spit on? Not those of you who are sitting close in the front rows. While I preach, that's not what I'm talking about. I mean, somebody's so mad at you or wanting to so disrespect you that they would spit on you. All of these, any one of these can make us want to kick into flight or fight mode, right? Jesus continued to remember his identity and his purpose. He was firm. He was not passive. He didn't answer all their accusations, but it was not because he was weak. It was because he was courageous. It couldn't have been easy. Remember, he was fully God, but he was also fully human. Like the parity we see in the NCAA tournament, I see a lot of irony that plays out in this moment in Jesus' life. For one, when Jesus is displaying such courage, one of his closest friends is acting a lot more like the cowardly lion. That person's name is Peter. And all 4 accounts of Jesus' life record Peter disowning Jesus. Like for us to look at Luke's recording of that in Luke chapter 22. Listen what Luke has to say. It says, "Seizing him, they led him away and took him to the house of the high priest. And Peter followed at a distance. There, some kindled a fire in the middle of a courtyard, and they sat down together. Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight, and she looked closely at him, and she said, 'This man was with him.' But Peter denied it, saying, 'Woman, I don't know him.' A little later, someone else saw Peter and said, 'You're also one of his disciples.' Peter replied, 'Man, I don't know. I am not.' About an hour later, another asserted, 'Certainly this man was a follower of his, for he's also a Galilean.' Peter replied, 'Man, I don't know what you're talking about.' Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the words the Lord had spoken to him. 'Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times.' And he went out and wept bitterly." as Jesus remained calm and focused and confident while being falsely accused and even abused by the most powerful people in his world, Peter faced testing at the hands of a young servant girl and some other servants who had gathered there to warm themselves by the fire that night in the court of the high priest. John, he writes his gospel in third person. He never refers to himself by name. And he seems to have some free to move around the cabin moments in the court of the high priest. He's kind of just meandering around where it seems like Peter is hiding in the shadows. He doesn't want to be recognized. John records that the third accusation of Peter knowing Jesus was actually made by a relative of Malchus, who got his ear lobbed off in the garden. He says, wait a minute, I recognize you. You were in the olive grove just a little bit ago. Peter denied it, and the rooster crowed. Can you imagine being Peter? Can you imagine that the moment you make that third denial, the rooster crows, you know what has happened in the moment, but then your eyes lock with Jesus. Those are the same eyes that invited you to be his follower. Those are the same eyes that you saw show love to your mother-in-law when she had a fever and be healed. They're the same eyes that invited you to walk on the water, and they're also the same eyes that rescued you when you started to sink. They're the same eyes that looked at you when Jesus washed your feet. It got me thinking, like, what was that look that Jesus gave Peter? Was it a look of disgust? Was it a look of betrayal? Was it a look of judgment? I think it was the same look that Jesus had towards a woman who was caught red-handed in the act of adultery, who deserved to be stoned, yet Jesus said to her, I don't condemn you. Go and sin no more. See that kind of love in Jesus' eyes. It's a love that shows courage, that he extended love and mercy to Peter, even to Judas, and really to all of us. I mean, I really don't see too much difference between Peter and Judas. They both betrayed their best friend, the Son of God, the Messiah. They both feel guilty for doing so. It would have been so much easier for Jesus just to write them off or to retaliate in that moment. They had stabbed him in the back. We know how Judas responded. He was so despondent and in such despair, he actually ended his life. We don't know much about how Peter processed this for the next couple of days, but what we do see is that when Peter heard that Jesus had resurrected, he ran to the tomb to see him. We also get that moment that John records where Jesus and Peter spend time together on the beach and they have breakfast after a miraculous catch of fish. We see how Jesus treats Peter in that moment and how Peter treats Jesus. I see courage in both of them. I love what happens to Peter. He begins to have confidence in his identity and his purpose. He learns how to be firm and not passive. He learns how to extend love and mercy courageously. Why? Because he had received it so abundantly. I love what happens because of the courage that Peter saw in Jesus. And he responded in the same way. The religious leaders established their charges against Jesus. They knew that they could not put Jesus to death other than by stoning. That's all that their law prohibited or allowed for. And that didn't seem to be good enough. They were out to make a mockery of Jesus. They wanted to discount him. They wanted to make a spectacle of him and embarrass him. And they knew the Romans were the best at that, especially perfecting a torture technique they called crucifixion. And so they took Jesus to the Roman governor, whose name was Pontius Pilate. Again, all four Gospels record this. I'd like to go back to John 18 and see some of the dialogue that Jesus and Pilate share. It's in verse 28. It begins, the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. And by now it was early morning. To avoid ceremonial uncleanliness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, what charges are you bringing against this man? They replied, if he wasn't a criminal, we would not have brought him to you. Pilate said, take him yourself then and judge him by your own law. "We have no right to execute anyone," they objected. And this took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Pilate then went back into the palace. He summoned Jesus and he asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus asked, "Is that your own idea, or did someone talk to you about me?" "I am a Jew," Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it that you've done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into this world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" Pilate retorted. It was now early morning in this moment, and it was pretty customary for the Roman leaders to begin their day at sunrise. And so that's why the religious leaders took Jesus there first thing. It was also during the celebration of unleavened bread. That's when the Passover celebration happens. And the irony here is that the religious leaders didn't want to make themselves unclean by entering the palace where Pilate was, a non-Jew, right? They wanted to be able to celebrate the Passover, and so they stood outside. The irony is that their hands were dirty with the blood of Jesus, that they had made all kinds of false accusations and were pursuing him, being persecuted and killed by crucifixion. Pilate was a shrewd man. He had made his way to his position by being really good at politics. He had done anything and used anyone to get to the top of the ladder. He saw through the facade of the religious leaders. He knew that they were jealous of Jesus. He kind of messes with them. But his interaction with Jesus, I think, is more sincere. In fact, I see the questions that Pilate poses to Jesus as a dialogue where he's actually wrestling with truth. He's wrestling with a sincere pursuit of faith. And I get that because so many times Pilate presents Jesus back to the religious leaders and said, "There's nothing that this man has done that's worthy of death." And yet they keep pressing him. They keep pressuring him to bring him to execute Jesus. And Pilate tries to get out of it many times. He actually has him flogged instead of scourged. That was a lesser type of punishment. He wanted to do that and give him back to the religious leaders, hoping that would satisfy them. But they were way more bloodthirsty than that. He tried to release another prisoner, which was kind of a custom of that day. Pilate said, "I'll give you Barabbas or I'll release Barabbas and keep Jesus," or vice versa. And they kept screaming, "Give us Barabbas, give us Barabbas." There's more irony there. The name Barabbas means son of the Father. What a wild comparison to Jesus, who was the Son of Almighty God. All in this moment, you see the confidence of Jesus, the courage of Jesus, who remembered his identity and his purpose, who continued to remain firm, not passive, who continued to extend love and mercy. I see Jesus, even though he had been brutally beaten by the religious leaders already, he's so present in the moment with Pilate, present like he was with the woman at the well who had sincere questions about faith, as present as he was with the rich young ruler who approached Jesus with, again, sincere questions of faith. I also see courage in Jesus that he was willing to entrust himself not to Pilate, not to the religious leaders, but to Almighty God. He knew the cup was there for him to drink. He entrusted himself to God, his Father, and let his plan play out for him. I see in this moment a lot of cowardly actions. I see the religious leaders who were cowardly. They make a statement, "We have no king except Caesar." That was blasphemous for a Jew to put that to their lips. It was also cowardly. I see Pilate acting as a coward who finally just gave in to the religious leaders and what they wanted. He had Jesus scourged, which was a much deeper type of punishment, and then ultimately sentenced to crucifixion. And in the face of it all, Jesus had that courage to remember his identity, his purpose, to remain firm to extend love and grace, and to trust God with the outcome of his life. I may have pointed out this before, but in The Passion of the Christ, my favorite moment of that whole movie, the most powerful moment of the movie, I should say, is when Jesus is strapped to a stump about that tall. He's literally having the flesh ripped off his back. He fell to his knees every time they hit him. And then he climbed back up to take it again. That, my friends, is not a picture of failure. That's a picture of courage like I've never seen. When I watch Jesus go through all of this, I'm profoundly impacted by the courage it took Jesus to walk through this moment in his life. Because Jesus walked through this difficult, even disaster in his life with courage, it teaches you and me how to do the same. You and I must face the challenges, the barriers, the obstacles, even the disasters that we might face with the same courage through the strength that Jesus can give us. You know, my team losing a basketball game is like a paper cut compared to the flesh wound that you and I may have received in other circumstances, certainly compared to what Jesus has walked through and what he's faced. You know, maybe you're dealing with a difficult situation right now. Maybe it's a difficult relationship. Maybe someone that you love or work with or live next to said something to you that has just broken your heart. Maybe it's difficult for you to think about how to have an honest conversation with them or to seek reconciliation. Maybe you need the courage to do both, or maybe you need the courage just to have peace within your own heart. You know, maybe you're a student, you're struggling in school. As hard as you've tried to get your arms around the subject, you just cannot seem to do it. Or maybe the major you chose is just not working out like you thought. And you need the courage to either work harder or to take a different direction. Maybe you need the courage to just ask for some counsel from a mentor. Or maybe the courage just to shoot straight with your parents and tell them what's actually going on. You know, maybe there's tension in your marriage. Maybe you have a child that's rebellious. Maybe your parents have unrealistic expectations. That doesn't seem to end at age 18. Maybe your boss is demanding. Maybe your coworkers lack integrity. And you need the courage to continue to not give up or give in, to not pursue a shortcut or a workaround, but just to continue to be honest and faithful and work hard and lean into the relationships that God's placed you in. You know, maybe you've been struggling with a specific sin. Maybe it's an addiction. And you've been relying on your own power to try to gain victory. Maybe you need the courage to acknowledge that you can't get victory over this on your own. You need the grace and mercy and the help that God will offer you and offers you freely. Maybe the diagnosis came back as cancer. Maybe your health is just deteriorating around you. Maybe the culture around you is so deteriorating that you just find yourself overly critical, maybe even cynical. For all of us, maybe the stress is rising, the tension is thick, maybe you feel betrayed, maybe you feel like your integrity is being questioned, maybe you feel like you're getting a raw deal, or maybe it's over. Maybe the divorce is final, you've been fired, you've only a few months to live. I want to encourage you with the courage of Jesus. You know what the word encourage means, right? It's to give courage, to give hope, to give strength, to give support. And my prayer is that we would be encouraged by the courage of Jesus, who had courage in the face of so many difficult things. So I want to challenge all of us to remember our identity and our purpose. All of us were created in the image of God, and that's with value, with dignity, and with a purpose. And that's to declare the glory of God in the way that we live and the way that we love, so that the world around us would see him. Do not let your circumstances keep defining you. Remember whose you are. You belong to God. He has value on you and purpose for you. I want to challenge you to be firm and not passive. Do not give up and do not give in. Stand for the truth and do so in love. I want to challenge all of us to extend love and mercy like Jesus did. Look for the good in every situation, and especially look for the good in every person. Quit holding people hostage to the high expectations you have for yourself. and love them the way that Jesus does, even when they don't meet your expectations. And I want to challenge you to trust God with the outcome of your life. I want us all to remember that we have one person to please, that's God Almighty, and He's the one who's actually in control of the whole world. When you look at the life of Jesus, especially in this moment, some people would see just failure. It's like the number one seed got knocked off, right? It just seems like they lost. I mean, Jesus, you're the King of Kings, you're the Lord of Lords, you're the Son of God, you are God. How could you let this happen to you? Why would you let this happen to you? It looks like foolishness. There's many who've thought this Jesus ending in death is just foolish. I love that the Apostle Paul addresses that. He did so when he wrote to the Corinthians, and he wrote these words, 1 Corinthians 1:18. The message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it's the power of God. My translation of that is, it's where our courage comes from. In Jesus, we find all wisdom. In Jesus, we find all peace and joy. In Jesus, we find all love and mercy and forgiveness. And in Jesus, we find all strength and all courage. We can receive the same power that empowered Jesus to have courage in all of these awful moments, to face our own obstacles, our own challenges, our own disasters. In Jesus, the way that He lived and loved with courage brings us salvation. It also brings us victory. He stared sin and death in the face so that you and I could have the courage to do the same. And my prayer is that we would follow the example of Jesus, be strengthened by Him from the inside out so that we would live and love like Him. We're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper right now. And in addition to remembering His sinless life, His death and resurrection, I would encourage you to remember His courage. Remember that He went through all of this for you, to shower upon you love and grace and mercy, and also to empower you to live the life He's called you to. Use these quiet moments to remember Jesus. When you're ready, you can take the bread that reminds us of His broken body for us, and then drink the juice that reminds us of His blood that was shed for us. Remember Jesus as you do.